What can churches do about the epidemic of young adults who seem to be walking away from their faith? There are a lot of alarming studies in recent years showing numbers ranging from 60 to 80% of Christian teens who are walking away from church entirely by their senior year of college. It's interesting that of that number, about 80% of them, when asked, would have told you in high school they never intended to walk away from church. So, what can we do as churches to address this problem? Obviously, it's complex and there are a lot of factors, and so there's no magical solution. What I'd like to do today is to share with you just a few simple ideas for what we as churches can do to connect our young people to their faith and to make sure that it goes with them into adulthood. The first principle is to make sure that in the presence of your young people, you are trying to speak their future into existence. Fortunately, God is not the only one whose words carry with them formative power. When you talk about someone, for better or for worse, you do help shape their destiny. People have a tendency to become self-fulfilling prophecies. So think about the way that you talk to your children and about your children. What kinds of things would they be imagining? I saw how powerful this can be when I was working at the Old Hickory Church of Christ. One of Old Hickory's claims to fame is that it was a very large congregation in the 1950s and 60s, back before it was common for many churches to reach 900 members, but they were a large church. But I think even more significantly, during this time period, they were able to produce something like 60 preachers and or missionaries in the 1950s. And I know that number only reflects the males, not even talking about how many of their young ladies grew up to be wives of ministers, missionaries in their own right, active Sunday school teachers. They produced so many leaders. So I went around and did a series of interviews with our older members who could remember the quote unquote glory days and started talking to them about what it was that made that time period so special. So what was going on? What were people doing? And the thing that I kept encountering over and over again really surprised me because it was so simple. But a lot of these people who had grown up to be leaders would tell you that they were active in their Sunday school program, but a very common occurrence was that while they were in class, you would randomly have either the preacher or one of the elders or deacons or some church leader who would just pop into the classroom, start making his way around the room and saying to each of the children, I really think God's going to do big things through you. I bet you're going to grow up to be a preacher. I bet you're going to grow up to be a missionary. I bet you're going to grow up to teach other people about God. I really believe that you can do that. And they made such a habit of talking about the possibilities of these children's futures. And amazingly, so many of these kids bought into those ideas and carried them along with them into adulthood. So give a lot of thought to the way that you talk to your children and about your children. I think sometimes it's easy for us to speak about teenagers as if they're problems. You'll have people want to talk to you about, oh, you know how teenagers are, or you know what it's like life with teenagers, or thank goodness we've got a youth minister so I don't have to deal with the teenagers. But when you talk about them in their presence that way, how do you think that makes them feel? If they're there at your church, involved, doing whatever part they're capable of doing, be very careful not to speak of them in disparaging ways, but make an effort with your children of every age to think about what kind of a future they could have and to help put those ideas in their heads through the ways that you talk to them. So begin by trying to speak their future into existence. Another idea that might be helpful that's similar to this one, take a critical look at your programs and think about what the intended goals and outcomes are of those programs. So are you really just trying to make sure that your kids have something fun to do all the way through the end of high school? Is the purpose of your youth ministry just to entertain them or to try and keep their attention somehow? Or are you engaging them at a deeper, more meaningful level? Do you have expectations for your young people, such as by the time you get out of high school, here are some things that you should have studied and have perhaps memorized or worked through? Here are some ways that you should have served. Do you have full expectation that by the time one of your young people graduates from high school, they're already competent to give a lesson, to teach a Sunday school class, to do something with their gifts, whatever those gifts are, to embody God's teaching to the people around them? But do you set expectations that by the time they get out of high school, they're actively ready for adulthood? Because if we're only trying to just kill time with them or keep them entertained, they're not going to develop the level of depth necessary for them to enter adulthood. So think about your programs, and if you are serious about seeing your young adults become Christian adults, are the things you're doing now likely to produce that kind of an outcome? Important to take a critical look at not just do we have a program, but what are the goals of our program, and do our methods align with those goals? Third suggestion is to actively work on cultivating friendships between generations. There's a lot of great information out there now about studies being done for how a child's friendships with generations other than their own can be so important in keeping them connected to the church. If the only people that your children have ever been around at church is their own peer group, then they might have a hard time imagining themselves as part of any other group. So if you have a youth group that's largely disconnected from the congregation as a whole, not actively engaged in what the rest of the congregation is doing, how can you really expect that they're going to be able to transition into young adulthood and know that there's a place for them or what it is that they're supposed to do? How do you transition them from one into the next? It's actually very helpful for your young people to have lots of friends at church that are not merely members of their own peer group. So I heard a powerful example of this from my friend Carlos Gupton at the Harding School of Theology. He was talking about one congregation that had a large number of young adult families starting to raise their children at this church, and researchers were asking all the questions trying to figure out why it was this church was succeeding. The surprising thing kept coming back in the name of this one gentleman who was in his 70s. And not that the worship services were bad, not that this preaching was bad, not that the classes were bad or unremarkable, but the thing that all the young adults kept mentioning was this one gentleman in his 70s. And so they asked him, what is it exactly that you were doing? How is it that you're connecting with these young people? And it was so simple. He and some others who were like-minded just decided that whatever young families came to their congregation, if they ever set foot in the door, their goal was that they were going to be more loved there than any place they had ever been. So he went as far as to get parents to give to him lists of when their children would be playing ball. There's a lot of wisdom in this because so many families are prone to skip church for ball games, and so they would make it a point to keep track of when the young people had games, and they would become their adopted grandparents with adopted grandchildren. And so they would show up at the games, they would wear the team colors, they would cheer for them, they would talk to the families, get to know the parents. And any young family who happened to cross their church would find that they had a whole army of grandparents just waiting to show them love and encouragement. And it wasn't long before the other parents on the team would start asking, are you related to those people? Do you know those people? And every time, no, these are people from my church, and they become like family to us. There's a lot of different ways to try and engage the different generations. There's prayer partners, there's different kinds of activities we can do together. But think about how your younger generation is engaging your older generation and vice versa. Because for younger people to be able to imagine themselves as an older person involved in church, they first have to see what that looks like. What does it look like for an older person to face the loss of a spouse? What does it look like for a 30-year-old to have a couple of kids and try and balance all those responsibilities while also remaining faithful to God? They need to have those models of people at different stages in life so that they can then imagine themselves in those places. There are obviously a lot of different complexities to this challenge of how we keep our young people plugged in and connected to God through church, but hopefully these are a few steps that might be worth considering. I'd love to hear from you and some of the things that you've done that have been working for you and your congregations. This is Mark Adams with Kingdom Upgrowth. Thanks for tuning in.